guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to CBMC Lord Mayor's Breakfast for 2014. Our guest speaker this morning is Michael Ramsden. Michael, delighted to welcome you to Belfast, delighted to welcome you to CBMC, and soon to welcome you to the platform. Michael is a director with the Stampede Zacharias Trust, founded in 1997. He grew up in the Middle East, returning to the UK to work and investing money for the Lord Chancellor's Department and for personal study. Michael is also a lecturer at Oxford University. He travels widely, possibly will speak 400 to 500 times during the course of 2014. Michael, if health permits, we hope it does, in universities, churches, at conferences, and events like ours this morning. Michael, I welcome you to the platform.
Thank you very much for your introduction and warm welcome, and it is a privilege for me to be able to speak to you. Whether it's a privilege for you to be able to listen to what I have to say, I'll leave up for you, but if you eat that breakfast regularly, you may want to have a little nap now to recover for the rest of the day, which I'm sure will be busy. The question of integrity and about integrity in business has, maybe to the surprise of some, become one of the main talked about issues of the 21st century. The challenge is, with words like that have such a long and rich heritage, we're not always sure exactly what they mean and what it entails. I was speaking on this subject matter in a very well-known bank in London last year, and as I sat in their boardroom, one of the most senior people in this bank and also one of their largest private clients, one of the largest companies in the United Kingdom, were talking with me, asking me various questions about how integrity was impacting their own business models. And then one of them said, I have to tell you this story. He said, my good friend who sat opposite you took his son to be interviewed for one of England's most prestigious schools just a couple of months ago. And the way the interviews work is the headmaster will interview the boys at age of entry, age 12, and the father will sit behind the son. He's not allowed to say anything. He sits in on the whole interview and hears the headmaster interviewing his son for a place at this school. And the interview is going very, very well, and the father's feeling very relaxed about it. And then the headmaster looked at the boy and asked him, "What is the thing that scares you the most?" And that's quite a good question. The boy was silent for a couple of seconds, looked down at the floor, and then looked up and said, "Oblivion." Now the headmaster was stunned. Oblivion has a variety of meanings, as most words do. It can mean to cease to exist in someone's mind. That's what most politicians live in terror of. It can mean to cease to exist at all, but whatever it is, it's not good. The headmaster was stunned by the response, and at the end of the interview, the boy was given acceptance to the school. But now the father is driving his son back in his Range Rover with the son in the passenger seat next to him, and all he can think about is, my son is terrified of oblivion. So when the moment seemed right, and when the conversation came to a natural point, as naturally and as calmly as he could, he said, when the headmaster asked you what terrifies you the most, you responded, oblivion. Why did you say that? And the boy looked at his father and said, well, that was the name of that really scary ride at the theme park we went to not long ago. Now you see the issue. A profundity was detected in the answer that, strictly speaking, really wasn't there. And when we talk about an issue like integrity and why it may matter in business, it raises very important questions to make sure we know what we're talking about. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary defines integrity as wholeness, being undivided, uncorrupted, sinless. Now, what I find interesting about all of those definitions is that they are almost all negative. Undivided, not being divided. Uncorrupted, not being corrupted. Sinless, being without sin. There's only one positive which is there, which is wholeness. What does it mean to be whole? To have the quality of being integrated, integrity. There is a wholeness, a completeness to the picture, to who we are as people, as well as people in business. What does that mean? How do we go about understanding it? The great writer and thinker G.K. Chesterton once wrote a very famous essay called The Medical Mistake. And he said, when we listen to politicians speak, very often they use a medical analogy, and they'll say, you know, our society is sick, our nation is sick, our city is sick, and what we need to do is we need to heal it, we need to make it better. He says, and we often hear, he says, in the social sciences, people using this medical analogy. But what he then went on to say was, I think this may be very wrong-headed. He said there is a very big difference between medical science and social science. In medical science, doctors often disagree about the nature of an illness, but they all agree on what a healthy body looks like. So although doctors may disagree about the nature of the sickness, they all know what it means to be whole. They may, by necessity, he said, send you home with one leg less, but they will not, in a creative rapture, send you home with one leg extra. There is an agreement on what it means to be whole and healthy. In the social science, he says, it looks very, very different. In the social sciences, everybody seems happy to say that we aren't well. What we can't agree on what it means to be good. So when it comes to politics, it is about the solutions that we tear our eyes out of. And what to one person is a solution to a problem, to someone else is worse than, that solution is worse than the problem it purports to solve. And so therefore this question of defining, when it comes to this question of integrity, of wholeness, what does that integrated picture look like, then becomes very, very important. Now you may have gathered already that I quite like words and meanings of words, and that's going to be very true. And I'm going to be looking at meanings of various words with you. I do apologize for that. I actually enjoy reading dictionaries. There are other people here who enjoy reading dictionaries, but you're ashamed to admit it. I can't recommend it too heartily. You will find that the plot is not that exciting, but it does explain every word as you go through. So what I would like to do, if I can, is borrow an outline from a man by the name of Aristotle. Don't worry if you haven't come across him recently. He died a little while ago. Who, in his book, The Politics, outlined 3 categories, which I would like to use in a slightly different way to which he used them to frame my thoughts I'd like to share with you this morning. But when he wrote The Politics, when he wrote the book, The Rhetoric, he said there are 3 things that you have to bear in mind. He labeled them ethos, pathos, logos, or to give a more colloquial, ethos, pathos, logos. So let me just take each of those. Ethos, ethic. Interestingly, Aristotle said, whenever you listen to a rhetorician speak, whenever you listen to a public speaker speak, the question you should ask yourself is not, what is the ethic they espouse? The question you need to ask yourself is, what is the ethic they live by? What does it look like in their own life? The question he is raising is one of trust. Can you trust them? Not what are the standards which they want to espouse for others, but what is the standard they actually live by themselves, and where on earth does it come from? How can they justify it? Now this is absolutely important, because whether you're in business relationship, family relationship, or friendship, all of those relationships depend on trust. And trust is a moral and ethical quality. A couple of months ago, I was asked to appear on every BBC local radio station in succession. They usually do 16 back-to-back, and you wake up nice and early, and then you just go bang, 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 bang through every single one. The topic for discussion was to do with something called the NatSal. The NatSal is the largest survey done in the world, in any country, on people's attitudes to sexual lifestyle and behavior. The reason why they wanted to talk was the NatSal had thrown up a very interesting statistic which no one was anticipating. It's only done once every 10 years. 10 years ago, when they last surveyed the nation, and they do something like 48,000 responses or 60,000 responses, it's a truly huge undertaking. One of the questions they asked was about people's attitudes to adultery. And 10 years ago, the response was over 2/3 of the people couldn't really see what the big problem was. When it was done this year, that statistic had dropped dramatically. Now with the majority of people saying that they thought that actually it was not a good idea or was wrong. And the question was, why, the BBC were asking. Are we as broadcasters out of touch with the average person? So this is the question they're putting to me, as if somehow I know what the average person actually thinks. I mean, I live in Oxford, for goodness sake. It's not exactly ground level. But as I reflected on that question, all I could think of is when we talk about a faithful friend, we're talking about someone we can depend on, someone who knows our weaknesses and our vulnerabilities and has our back. But when you talk about an unfaithful lover, that is someone on whom you can't depend, who has broken your trust and broken your promises. And if you've experienced that kind of pain in your life, you know how devastating it can be. All relationships are morally governed, because all relationship is founded on trust. And even in the business world, it's not the fact that we don't do business with people we can't trust. Whether consciously or subconsciously, we're continually taking a moral audit. And the greater the moral risk we see in any particular client relationship, the greater the reward we demand in order to justify the risk that we're taking, because we realize that we may not get out of it what we hope, or indeed what we have been promised. There was a TV series done a couple of years ago, and it got discontinued coming out of the States, called Lie to Me. I don't know if any of you saw it. It was based on the real-life research of Professor Paul Ekman. Now, Paul Ekman made himself famous and has now made a large sum of money by working with security services around the world, and also now major major corporations in terms of their governance. Because his research showed that regardless of where you were born, what culture you were from, what country you were from, or where you were raised, every face gave a universal language. And if you could read the universal language on everyone's face, what are called micro-expressions, which aren't influenced by culture or anything else, you could detect when people were lying. And this is now how he makes all of his money. Now, as you would expect, someone who spent the last 35 to 40 years asking the question, how can you detect by reading someone's face when they are lying to you, has also given some thought to what it means when we do lie. Listen to what he says when commentating on one of his own TV programs. He says, "Trust is a matter of faith, that the person who is trusted won't exploit that trust. Intimacy in close working relationships, romance, and/or friendships requires and in fact depends on trust. But it is well known that the last person to realize that he or she is being betrayed is the person suffering the betrayal. Why? Because the betrayed's trust quite simply blocks out all recognition of the signs belying the breach of faith, all those signs that everyone around them so easily picks up on. We don't want to learn that our trust is being betrayed, that the person we hired is embezzling, that our children are stealing money from our purses. It is terrible to discover that our trust is being misgiven. Consequently, most of us will deliberately avoid any clues to that discovery. Once trust has been betrayed, can it ever be restored? Not always, and not by everyone. Even when the betrayal is forgiven and the betrayed does not want to give up the relationship, it may still be very difficult to completely trust again. That is the price of lying about very serious matters, the loss of trust that may never be restored. Suspicion, on the other hand, the opposite of trust, undermines relationships and results in the suspicious person's misery. Let me just say that again. Suspicion, on the other hand, the opposite of trust, undermines relationships and results in the suspicious person's misery. All of us face choices about this. Do we, based on faith, take the risk of being misled by trusting? Or do we take the risk not only of disbelieving a truthful person, but never being able to establish close connections because of our chronic suspicion? Who do you trust? On what basis is that trust given? Some of you here are business owners. Would you employ someone who you knew you couldn't trust? It's very interesting how, especially when you talk in business, I don't know why it happens. When I fly around the world, I find people get to talk to you on the aeroplane, and one of the things I do is I teach business ethics. And people would say to me, "What do you do?" "Oh, I teach business ethics." And laughter was normally the response. That seems to be happening less. In business, we often ask the question, can I afford to be moral? Can I afford it? And the cost of a moral or ethical position is high. And if you share your business model with me, I can calculate it for you. I can tell you how much it will cost you. But even though the cost of compliance is high, the cost of failure can be catastrophic. In 2001, after the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers in North America, stock markets around the world collapsed. Now, by early 2002, they had largely recovered. Now, those of you who can cast your mind back to February, March, and so on of 2002 will remember that after the WorldCom scandal and the Enron scandal, the market fell further and faster than it did after the terrorist attacks of 9/11, showing that what the market feared most was not a terrorist attack from without, but a moral corruption within. Towards the end of that year, I was in one of the world's largest banks, with in front of me 6 of the largest private clients of this particular banking group. One of them asked me a question which I'll never forget, because he looked at me and he said, "Do you think that confidence will return to the market anytime soon?" And I smiled and I said, "Well, that's an easy question to answer. You can answer it more easily than I can. If you think the kind of moral failure we have just witnessed are one-offs, then confidence will return soon. But if you think this kind of thing is endemic, then I don't see a future in the long term for us." And all of the color drained from this guy's face. And I can remember thinking, now's the time to sell. What is the ethic we are living by? What is the ethic you live by? Where does it come from? And on what basis is it justified? Who do you trust? I was speaking in Pakistan a couple of years ago, and at the end of my talk, a psychiatrist stood up to ask a question. And he said, "You talked a lot about the fact that we need to learn to trust God in our lives. I have a question for you," he said. "Can God trust us?" Now, isn't that an interesting question? I remember looking at him and formulating the beginning of my response by saying, "You know, Jesus once appeared before a crowd, and it says in the Gospel of John that he didn't trust himself to them because he knew what was in their hearts. But if you ask me, Jesus Christ does want to trust us, but first of all, he has to transform us." Who do you trust? Ethos. Where do you get it from? Secondly, pathos. What drives you? What gets you out of bed in the morning? What makes what you are doing worthwhile? Is it simply to make money? Now, if it's just money you're interested in, I'll be honest with you, you don't need any form of integrity. Because so long as you can cheat and not get caught, you will be highly successful in monetary terms. But there are some bigger questions that come here when it comes to pathos. Now here, in this section, I'm indebted to 3 Oxford University academics, Professor Avner Offer, Cicelli Professor of Economic History, Professor John Lennox, here from Northern Ireland, a Professor of Theoretical Mathematics, and also Professor Colin Meyer, the former head of the Said Business School and one of the leading economists at Oxford today. Let's just start with understanding about economics. When I was taught economics at school, I was taught about something called the rational consumer. And the rational consumer acted in such a way that you could predict his behavior and draw pretty little graphs. Now, some of you may have done economics, and you may be aware of these supply curves and demand curves, which you learn right at the ground zero of all economic theory and understanding. However, one of the least controversial statements to make in economic theory today is that the idea of a rational consumer is a myth. All of our research shows that consumers will consistently make self-defeating choices. For the classical economists of the 18th century, if you were talking about building up wealth in a nation, one of the qualities necessary to establish and build up wealth would be the moral quality of prudence. Prudence is the ability to judge between the immediate and the future. When do you hold off consuming now and delay gratification in order to invest to get a greater return which is yet to come? And how do you know when is the time to legitimately enjoy your rewards? So prudence, that moral quality, was essential for building up wealth. Wealth, however, they said, gives rise to temptation. And temptation, if it is unchecked, will eat up wealth. Now, this is the challenge for all second and third generation wealth within families. Because the flow of new rewards into our life, and a constant flow of new reward into our life, undermines our capacity to enjoy them. In the absence of a discipline to control our passions, we can end up spinning out of control, and a few people every year, sometimes right at the very top, spin out of control completely. Now, this is where I think Avner Offer is very, very insightful. Many of us mistake the presence of an ethos, a moral principle in our life with scarcity to control our passions. Because the question isn't just about what drives us and gets us up in the morning. The question is what makes sure that what driving us doesn't actually drive us into ruin. As it says in the book of Proverbs, there is a way that seems right to a person, but its path leads to death. We often mistake scarcity for prudence. Scarcity means we don't have a lot of economic means at our disposal to indulge everything we want. Choices are made for us by necessity. However, in affluence, when success comes, scarcity becomes scarce. So scarcity, which focused and channeled our direction and our life, now disappears. The question is, what continues to provide that drive and that focus to take things forward in that kind of way, without it just simply dissipating and collapsing in on itself? What is it that makes this worthwhile? Now, Jesus' very famous words, which are known to many and sometimes strike fear into almost all business hearts, are when in Matthew 6:24, where Jesus very famously says, "You cannot serve two masters, you cannot serve both God and money." Now, it's very, very interesting how many people interpret this passage to think that what Jesus is saying is you cannot make money, which, if you're in business, would be problematic, I admit. But that's not what it says. Jesus never asked the question about what you can make. The question is about who do you serve. The question is about fundamental motivation. What is it that drives us? Is there a bigger picture than this? In the collapse of your ethos, of your ethic, there comes nothing left to guide and direct our passions. We so often make self-defeating choices. At the time, it feels like we can justify them, and justify them in every single possible way. Now, it's interesting that even within the Christian community, when you ask the next question, well then, what is the passion, the pathos, the motivation that drives work? Most Christians will say, well, that's easy. We need to make money to provide for our family and to be responsible citizens. Now, there's a problem with that answer, which is if you continue reading what Jesus Christ happens to say in Matthew 6, he then argues against that. He then says the motivation to go to provide for food, clothing, and housing, that's the non-Christian answer to this question, he says. Now, that should raise, hopefully, a problem for every single one of you in this room. If the motivation isn't to make money to provide, then what is the motivation? Now, this is where my colleague John Lennox, I feel, has been so insightful. Jesus goes on to say, do not run after and worry about what you will eat and what you will wear or where you will sleep. Everyone else runs after those things. But instead, seek first God, his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these other things will be added to you. In other words, food, clothing, and housing is the byproduct of work. It's not the goal of it. Now, this is where I find Professor Colin Meyer, the head of the Side Business School, incredible. He's written a book called Firm Commitment. It's rapidly becoming a bestseller in business circles, in which he argues exactly the same thing. The way our economy works is that food, clothing, and housing are the byproducts of work. They're not the goal of it. The goal is something greater and bigger, and we have to figure out what it is. If you don't know what the goal is and you lose sight of the goal, you will take shortcuts to get the byproducts. When I was flying over here yesterday evening, I was reading through the Financial Times, and on the front page of the Financial Times yesterday, as on almost every single day, the 2 out of the 3 banner headlines were all to do with integrity, ethos, how we live, and what is the purpose in which we're doing all of this. C.S. Lewis very famously likened ethics to being captain of a boat. He said, if you're the captain of a boat, there are 3 questions you're going to have to ask yourself. Number 1, how do I stop from sinking? He called this your personal ethics. 2, how do I stop from bumping into other ships? He called that social ethics. And 3, why am I out here in the first place? Your essential ethics. Your essential ethics are vital to guiding your passions. What is it that gets you out of bed, that makes it worthwhile? Now, this then leads into the final point, logos. Now, the way that Aristotle meant this was to do both with word and logic. Logos is the Greek word where we get the English word logic from. And it is fundamentally to do with the understanding of what the words mean. And it is to do with meaning and finding meaning, a framework of interpretation which we can apply to understand it. Now, this is where we often feel a tension between what we would call idealism and realism. And it's the job of every single leader. On the one hand, we have realism, describing the way the world really is. And on the other hand, the ideal, what it could actually be. And most people who exercise genius and leadership are able to properly define the first one, adequately explain the second one, and find a bridge to take from things where they are to where they can be. In that sense, all of us are looking not just simply for a word to inform our life, to make sense of what we're doing, but also to transform us. Let's just come back to where we started, with that question from the guy in Pakistan. This question becomes very important. When someone is wrestling with the idea of meaninglessness in their life, very often that sense of meaninglessness hasn't come because they're reading some complicated book on philosophy. It's normally much more straightforward than that. It is the tension between the ideal and the real. The way the world as we think it should be and the way the world actually is. And it becomes acute when we look inside and we see the way that we actually are and what we actually look like and compare that against the measure which we would use for ourselves. Now, there are two ways of dealing with this tension. The first one is to live in an agonized state of hypocrisy. I know what it should look like, I know what I should be, and I know how I project myself to other people, and I also know the reality, and there is a huge gulf between them, and the trick is in somehow maintaining the public face while at the very best trying to quell the internal storms. Now, the other way of dealing with the problem is to simply to drop the standard. So instead of having the standard up here and your life down here, you simply bring the standard down to where your life is, and you say, well, that's just the way it is. And now that problem has gone. But it seems to me there may also be a third way. Because the question comes and the question remains, is it possible to find a way from where we feel this tension to a point whereby there can be a joy in the expression of who we are in terms of what we do? Now, this is where I think the Christian faith is utterly unique. If we have to ask questions as to ethos, what is the ethic that we live by? And we have to ask questions as to pathos, what is the passion that gets us up and keeps us going? And then we come to this question of logos, where do we find meaning and hope within that? It would seem that we need the logos, the word, not simply to provide meaning and understanding, but also the hope of some kind of transformation. Now, it's very interesting that when Christians talk about the fact that we live in a fallen world and a broken world, many people interpret that as being entirely negative. Now, I would like to suggest to you that's not the best way of thinking about it. When we talk about the fact that we live in a fallen and broken world, that word comes, first of all, to explain. Let me explain what I mean. My eldest daughter is 14 and a half, and up until about a year ago, she had very long hair all the way down to the bottom of her spine. She'd been growing it for years. And one day when I was traveling off to go and speak somewhere, she said, "Daddy, you have to be prepared because when you come home, I'm going to have had a haircut." And I was like, okay. And when I landed in the country, I understood the severity of the nature of the haircut when my wife rang me as I was coming back home in a car to say, whatever you do, don't say anything about Lucy's hair apart from she is beautiful. So I come in, and now my daughter's hair is all the way up to here, and I walk in, and I give her a big hug, and I say, "Sweetheart, you look beautiful." I always take orders. But of course, eventually curiosity gets the better of you. So 4 days later, We're sitting on the couch, and now I'm waiting for the moment to ask the question I want to ask, which is, sweetheart, your hair looks lovely. And still, my wife's advice still ringing in my ears. What made you decide to have such a big change? And she said, well, I was watching this program on BBC about a month ago about a charity that works with girls who have leukemia, 6, 7, 8 years old. And one of the problems they have is when they give the radiation, the girls lose their hair. And the problem is trying to find hair donors who can donate long enough hair for them to make wigs for them. So she said, what I did was I decided I'd have my hair cut and I'd send it to this charity. So she'd washed and conditioned her hair that day and had it plaited in a special kind of way and had it cut up as high as it possibly could be so that she could send as much of it as possible to this group. I love reading books, and I was reminded of a line in the book Little Women where the main female character in that book sells her hair to buy a ticket to pay for her mother to go to a war hospital to visit her father who's in danger of dying from a war wound. And the mother looks at the daughter and says, your hair will grow back, but you'll never be more beautiful than you are to me right now. And I can remember as Lucy was telling me that story thinking, I could say that to you right now and mean every word of it. When we talk about the fact that we are fallen, it's not the fact that we never see anything in any human action or activity that doesn't make us think, wow. But right side alongside it, in the same heart and the same life, we can also see selfishness and greed and anger and everything, all mixed up together. We live in a world where we are struggling, and it describes the human condition. That is where we actually are, all of us in this room, aspiring to greatness, but in our times of privacy, aware of what we're really like. Integrity matters in business because integrity matters in all of life. And when we detect a lack of integrity in our own lives, it starts us causing to ask serious questions. And the ultimate question has to be, well, is there any way out of this? What do we do when integrity fails? So, if I may, let me just bring this down into an even more personal level. When we ask the question as individuals, what do we do with failure of integrity? The two immediate things that follow hot on the heels of that question are to do with forgiveness and redemption. Now, it's interesting, when we fail, what we're hoping for is forgiveness. The trouble is that when forgiveness and mercy are used at the expense of justice, it often makes other people feel angry or fall into a state of despair. Because when justice collapses in any society, hope collapses with it. I remember speaking in a very troubled part of the world once, and there was again time for people to ask questions. And this particular audience, I'm just trying to think how I can word this correctly, were of a very radical mindset, and some of them in the room were potentially armed, which always makes you think carefully how you will answer the questions. And so this young guy stood up at the back of the room, and he said, I have a question for you. He said, I've asked it many times to many Christians, but I've never had a satisfactory answer. He says, and this is my question. You Christians say that in order for human beings to be forgiven, that Christ, the Son of God, has to die on the cross. Why? It doesn't make any sense to me. If God is forgiving, why can't he just forgive people? Why the necessity for something like that? So I thanked him for his question and asked him to take a seat, because that way the line of fire would not quite be so direct. And I said, if I understand your question correctly, I said, you're asking a very profound question. And it does go right to the heart of what Christians believe. It is true that we look for mercy. The trouble is mercy, by definition, is always extended at the expense of justice. You are merciful when you don't do what justice demands and you say, I'll forgive you. So justice says they should get that. We decide to exercise mercy. They get something different. That's why it's mercy. If we gave them what they deserve, that would be justice, and it wouldn't be mercy in the way that we would understand it. So mercy is always exercised at the expense of justice. Now, this becomes a challenge for any society. How do you bring about mercy and forgiveness without also crossing the boundaries of justice at the same time. Because when justice fails, we often respond with anger. We don't like it. Although many of us believe that God may be forgiving, this causes an even greater problem for God. Because the same logic that would extend to us would extend to him. His mercy must always be extended at the expense of his justice. But that isn't true at the cross of Christ. At the cross of Jesus Christ, mercy isn't extended at the expense of God's justice. Mercy is extended through God's justice. At the point of the cross, where Jesus Christ makes himself one with every human being and takes on into his heart and life everything that has gone wrong in ours, and takes the punishment and the penalty as he becomes one with us. Justice is fulfilled. Crimes and things that we have done and our failings are dealt with. And as a result of having dealt with it and having paid, he then extends his mercy through his cross. This is why Christians talk about a great doctrine called justification as opposed to mercification. It is the idea that God and the judge of all the earth will do right. Nobody will get away with anything. Every failing, every failure, every wrong thing, justice is ultimately met out. No one gets away with anything. He pays the price. He takes the cost. And through fulfilling that and having him paid, through his resurrection, he comes and then offers and extends forgiveness to everyone else. Not in the absence of justice, but in the presence of it. You know, there is a way of enforcing justice in the world that can make it look ridiculous. I can remember living in Saudi Arabia, there used to be a story told about a businessman British businessman who leaves the country and forgets when he returns it's traffic week. Now, I don't know if they still do this in Saudi. I think they do. But when I lived in Saudi Arabia, you could break almost every rule of the road for 51 weeks of the year. But for 1 week of the year, all the rules of the road will be enforced to the letter. So if your wheel of your car rolled up onto the white line in front of a traffic light, if there were a white line, you would be arrested and put in jail for the rest of traffic week. So you get caught on day one, you spend 7 nights in jail. You get caught on the last day, you just spend 1 night in jail. But every breach of the traffic rules, there's only one sentence, and it's jail for the rest of traffic week. So the stories of the businessman, he comes back, he forgets his traffic week, his car rolls onto the white line at the red light, there's a policeman there, and he gets thrown in jail, and the guy says, as they lock the door, he says, "This is an outrage, I demand to speak to the British ambassador." And the guy in the cell next door said, "Yes, what is it you want?" There are ways, at times, of enforcing some rules in ways that seem to be petty. But there is a very real sense in which none of us want to see a failure of justice in this world, especially when it comes to our own lives and our own family. What makes it possible to extend forgiveness is the knowledge of knowing that actually justice is done and it is upheld. And it's done ultimately through the cross of Christ. Now this then, I suppose, brings us to a conclusion. And I'm wondering if I could ask you just to take a moment. I guess there are 3 responses to what I've said so far. The first might be complete disagreement with everything I've said, in which case I hope you've enjoyed breakfast, and even though you didn't agree with anything I said, that at least it was worthwhile you being here, and that something was said. I guess the second one would be to say, well, all this does is leave me with a lot more questions. Well, if you're in a situation where you feel that listening to something like this is just provoking more and more questions, and you want to find out more, you will see on your tables there's a little response card, and it asks for a name and a way of contacting you. And there's a second box there which says, apart from keeping me informed of events, is I would like to speak to someone personally about what I heard today. And if that is you and you tick that box, within 48 hours, I've been promised, someone will get in contact with you, meet up with you, and do their utmost to answer the questions that you feel that you now have. The third response would be to know that at this point, you're at a place where you already are convinced that you believe what I have been saying. It's almost as if you're sitting here, it's almost as if you feel like God himself has somehow reached out to your life and your heart, and he's just got his hand on it. Well, if that's where you are, there's a very simple response to make, and it's to ask for forgiveness. We recall it, a fancy word in the Christian faith, repentance. Let's supposing I were to offend you. And let's supposing you were willing to forgive me. What is the process by which I receive your forgiveness? Well, assuming that you're willing to forgive me, and I'm the one who's done something wrong, the way I receive your forgiveness is I come up and I say, I'm sorry. Now, if I mean that, and you're serious about wanting to forgive, that becomes the means by which I receive your forgiveness. It's amazing. Have you ever had the experience where you've accidentally insulted a friend? It's probably just me, it's my Middle Eastern blood, it takes over sometimes. But have you ever had the experience where you've accidentally insulted a friend, you go up to them afterwards, as soon as the words leave your mouth, you just wish you could take back those 5 seconds and you wouldn't say it. So you go to them and you say, I shouldn't have said what I said, I'm really sorry. And they say, it was nothing, forget about it. It's interesting, isn't it? The very next time you see them, you need 1 nanosecond in the room to know whether they've forgiven you or not. Have you noticed that? It's incredible. If it really was nothing, you can tell. But if it's something, it's a problem, isn't it? And actually it's quite annoying, because you go up again and you say, look, I really am sorry, I shouldn't have done it. And if they say it's nothing again, it's still a problem, isn't it? Because that reconciliation will never come. For the reconciliation to come, if they are willing to forgive and you are willing to admit what you have done wrong, at that point of admittance and saying sorry, that becomes the moment at which you receive their forgiveness. And you only need 1 nanosecond in the room with them the very next day to realize whether you've been forgiven or not. Well, that is what goes right to the heart of the Christian gospel. God knows exactly what we're like. He knows exactly what we've done. He's willing to pay and has paid for what we have done. And he extends forgiveness to everyone. And the way to receive it is simply to say, sorry. So if you're in that place, I would love to offer just a brief prayer for you, which is just a very simple prayer that says, I'm sorry, and I need that forgiveness. So I'm wondering if I could just ask you just to take a moment just to think about which of those 3 groups you may fall into. And if you do fall into the first group of disagreeing with everything, then I'm going to be staying around here as long as you would like to talk to me or you have the capacity to, and I'll do my very best to answer whatever questions you may have. But if you fall into that third group, I'm wondering if we could just take a moment. What I'd ask you to do is just, if it helps to close your eyes or whatever, just to focus. If you're worried about who you're sitting with, do feel free to put your hand on your purse or your wallet. We live in a fallen and broken world, and you have no idea who's sitting next to you. And my question would be, are you at that place where this day you know you need to say to him, yes, I'm sorry, and I need your provision for forgiveness? If you are, then please do pray this prayer with me. Father, I want to thank you for the fact that you know me. Father, I thank you that you know exactly what I'm like, and you know my failings. And yet, you love me. I thank you for the provision you've made for me, and for the price you have paid. And I am sorry for what I've done, and I need your forgiveness. Help me to follow you, whatever it may cost. And may I know that intimacy with you. Amen. Well, thank you for listening so well. I can say this completely honestly. I speak all over the world, but out of all of the audiences I've ever spoken to in my entire life, you are by far the most recent. Thank you very much.